Officer Sarah Mitchell sat in her patrol car, watching the morning sun rise over Cedar Grove. The small town was just waking up, and she was already 3 hours into her shift. Her dark brown fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel as she thought about how much had changed in the past month. Being the only black female officer in Cedar Grove wasn't easy. The other two black officers, both men, worked different shifts, so she rarely saw them. But Sarah didn't mind. She was used to being different. At the police academy, she had graduated at the top of her class, beating out 45 other candidates for this position. The radio crackled to life. Unit 247, we got a noise complaint at Lou's Bar on Madison Street. Sarah picked up the radio, Unit 247 responding. On my way. She knew Lou's Bar well. It was a popular spot for bikers, especially on Sunday afternoons. As she drove through the quiet streets, Sarah thought about her father. He had been a biker too, one of the good ones who organized charity rides and helped lost travelers. The memory of his smile made her own lips curve upward. 10 years on the force in Detroit, and he had never lost his belief that most people were good at heart. Even after everything he'd seen, he kept that faith until the day he died. The rumble of motorcycles grew louder as Sarah approached Lou's Bar. She could see about 15 bikes parked outside, their chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. Some she recognized as belonging to the Iron Knights, a group known for causing trouble in neighboring counties. They had a reputation for more than just bar fights. There were whispers about racism and hate crimes, but nothing that had ever stuck in court. Sarah parked her patrol car across the street, taking in the scene. The bar's windows were open, and loud rock music poured out along with the sound of rough laughter and shouting. A group of men stood outside, some leaning on their bikes, others standing in a tight circle. They'd all turned to look as she stepped out of her car. She caught snippets of their conversation going quiet, replaced by mumbles and dark chuckles. Sarah kept her face neutral, professional. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Baby girl, fear is like gasoline. Throw it on a fire, and everything just burns faster. But stay cool, stay smart, and you can put out any blaze." The leader of the group was easy to spot. Jake Thornton stood a head taller than most of his friends, with a gray beard and arms covered in faded tattoos. Sarah had reviewed his file just last week: 3 assaults, 2 drunk and disorderly charges, and several complaints of racial intimidation, all either dropped or pleaded down to lesser charges. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Sarah called out, her voice clear and steady. "We've had some complaints about the noise level. Mind turning it down a bit?" The men exchanged looks. One of them spat on the ground near his bike. Jake Thornton took a step forward, his boots scraping against the gravel. Well, looks like they're letting all kinds wear the badge these days." Sarah kept her hand relaxed, away from her weapon, but stayed alert. She'd been trained for this, had dealt with similar situations before. But something felt different today. The air was thick with tension, like the moment before a storm breaks. More bikers emerged from the bar, forming a loose circle around her. Sarah noticed their patches: Iron Knights on every vest, the logo of a male fist clutching a sword. She counted 12 men now, with more inside the bar. The music seemed to grow louder, as if someone was deliberately turning up the volume. "I'm just here about the noise complaint," Sarah repeated, her voice still professional but firmer now. "Let's keep this simple." Jake took another step forward. "Simple?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Ain't nothing simple about this, girl. You're in the wrong place, wearing the wrong uniform, carrying the wrong authority." Sarah stood her ground, even as the circle of men tightened around her. She could feel the heat of the afternoon sun on her neck, hear the rumble of more motorcycles approaching in the distance. This wasn't just about a noise complaint anymore. She could see it in their eyes, in the way they moved. This was about to become something much bigger. Her radio crackled softly at her shoulder, a reminder that help was just a call away, but Sarah Mitchell didn't reach for it. Not yet. She had learned from her father that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was stand your ground and face what was coming. And something was definitely coming. The tension at Lou's Bar grew thicker as Jake Thornton and his Iron Knights moved closer to Officer Sarah Mitchell. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and the music from inside the bar seemed to pulse with the growing hostility in the air. "You've got exactly 10 seconds to get back in that car and drive away," Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of years of hatred. We don't need your kind here, playing cop in our town. Sarah noticed how the other bikers were positioning themselves, spreading out to cut off her path back to the patrol car. She'd seen this tactic before. It was meant to make her feel trapped, to spark panic. But Sarah wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. Mr. Thornton, she said calmly, using his name to show she knew exactly who he was. I've got a job to do here. Same as any other officer would do. The music's too loud, and the neighbors are complaining. Simple as that. One of the younger bikers, a man with a fresh Iron Knights tattoo on his neck, pushed forward. You hear that, boys? She thinks she can come here and give us orders. His laugh was sharp and nervous, like he was trying to prove himself to the others. Sarah kept her eyes on Jake, recognizing him as the real threat. The others were following his lead, and their next move would depend on his reaction. She noticed his hand clenching and unclenching at his side, a telltale sign of building aggression she learned to spot at the academy. You know what happened to the last cop who tried to tell us what to do? Jake took another step closer, close enough now that Sarah could smell the mix of leather and beer on his breath. He decided real quick that retirement was his best option. The circle of bikers tightened, and someone turned the music up even louder. The bass thumped through the ground, vibrating under Sarah's feet. She could feel sweat running down her back, but her voice remained steady. That's interesting, she said, still maintaining eye contact with Jake, because I heard he moved to Florida and opened a fishing charter business. In fact, I talked to him last week about some of your old cases. That wasn't true, but Sarah saw the flicker of uncertainty cross Jake's face. She was letting him know that she'd done her homework, that she wasn't some rookie who could be easily intimidated. Suddenly, one of the bikers shoved her from behind. Sarah stumbled forward, but caught herself, years of training kicking in as she maintained her balance. She turned slowly, facing the man who'd pushed her. He was young, probably in his early 20s, with a patchy beard and wild eyes. That's assault on an officer, Sarah said, her voice carrying across the now quiet parking lot. You want to add that to your record, son? The young biker looked uncertain for a moment, glancing at Jake for guidance. But before anyone could react, a deep voice cut through the tension. What seems to be the problem here? Everyone turned to see Marcus Road King Thompson standing at the bar's entrance. He was a tall, powerfully built black man in his 60s, wearing a different club's colors. Behind him stood several members of his own motorcycle club, the Freedom Riders. Jake's face darkened. This ain't your business, Road King. Stay out of it. When you surround a police officer in my neighborhood, it becomes my business, Marcus replied, his voice calm but carrying authority that came from decades of respect earned on the road. The Iron Knights shifted uneasily. Everyone knew the Freedom Riders' reputation. They were one of the oldest and most respected motorcycle clubs in the state, known for their charity work and community service. Sarah kept her stance neutral, but she felt the dynamic shifting. What had started as a simple noise complaint had turned into something much bigger, a power struggle between old hatred and new possibilities. Marcus stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. Officer Mitchell here is doing her job, the same job that keeps our streets safe for everyone, including bikers. Now, how about we all take a step back and handle this like adults? The Iron Knights looked to Jake, waiting for his response. The next few moments would determine whether this situation exploded into violence or found a different path. Sarah could feel her heart pounding, but her face remained calm as she watched Jake Thornton struggle with the choice in front of him. The music from the bar had gone quiet, and in the silence, the sound of distant police sirens began to grow louder. The approaching sirens made several Iron Knights glance nervously at their bikes, but Jake Thornton stood his ground. His face had turned red with anger at Marcus Thompson's interference. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge. Sarah knew the next few moments were crucial. She could wait for backup to arrive, but that might just push these men into a corner. Instead, she did something unexpected. She reached for her radio and turned it off with a clear click that everyone could hear. Dispatch already knows where I am, she said calmly, but let's talk for a few minutes before my colleagues arrive. Just talk. Jake sneered. Talk. About what? How you people are trying to take over everything? Sarah took a deep breath and did something that went against every bit of standard police training. She sat down on the hood of her patrol car, making herself less threatening. The move surprised everyone, including Marcus and his Freedom Riders. "My father was a biker," she said, her voice carrying across the parking lot. "He rode a custom Harley Street Bob, midnight blue with silver trim, built it himself from the ground up." This caught Jake off guard. He hadn't expected a conversation about motorcycles, especially not now. Some of the younger Iron Knights exchanged confused looks. "Every Sunday," Sarah continued, "he'd take me for rides through Detroit. Said there was no better way to really see a city than from the back of a bike. He was also a cop, 20 years on the force." "Was?" one of the younger bikers asked before Jake could stop him. Sarah nodded, keeping her eyes steady. "He was killed 5 years ago. Not on duty. He was at a gas station, still wearing his riding clothes. Some people didn't like seeing a black man on an expensive bike. They didn't know he was a cop, not that it would have mattered to them." The parking lot had gone completely quiet. Even the birds seemed to be listening. Marcus Thompson moved closer, his face showing he understood exactly what she was telling them. "They beat him to death," Sarah said, her voice still steady but filled with a pain that everyone could hear. 6 men against 1. He didn't even fight back. Witnesses said he kept trying to talk to them, right until the end. He believed that hate came from fear, and fear came from not understanding each other. She looked directly at Jake. "That's why I became a cop. Not to push anyone around, not to take over anything. I wear this badge because I believe what my father believed, that we're all just people trying to live our lives, and sometimes we need someone to help us remember that." One of the older Iron Knights, a man with gray hair showing under his bandana, suddenly walked away from Jake's group. He moved to stand in the neutral space between Sarah and the others. "My name's Bill," he said gruffly. "Been riding with the Knights for 20 years, but this ain't right, Jake. This ain't what we're supposed to be about." Jake's face twisted with rage. "You turning soft, old man?" "No," Bill replied firmly. "I'm remembering who I am. My grandson's dating a black girl, sweetest thing you've ever met. Every time I see them together, I think about all the hate I've carried around. It's exhausting, Jake. And for what?" 3 more Knights moved to join Bill. The younger biker who had pushed Sarah earlier looked torn, shifting his weight from foot to foot before finally stepping away from Jake as well. The sirens were getting closer, but now they seemed less important. Sarah stayed seated on her patrol car, watching as more Knights began to distance themselves from their leader. Marcus and his Freedom Riders remained alert but relaxed, sensing the change in the air. Jake looked around at his dwindling group, his authority crumbling before his eyes. The hatred on his face was now mixed with something else, confusion, and maybe a hint of fear. "This ain't over," he growled, but his voice had lost its power. "You're right," Sarah replied softly. "It's just beginning. But maybe it can begin with understanding instead of hate." As the first backup units turned into the parking lot, lights flashing, Sarah stood up slowly. The situation had transformed into something none of them had expected, a moment of truth, not just for Jake Thornton and his Iron Knights, but for everyone there. It was a reminder that sometimes the strongest weapon against hatred wasn't force or fear, but the simple act of sharing our common humanity. As 3 police cars pulled into Lou's Bar's parking lot, the scene they found was far different from what they expected. Instead of a violent confrontation, they saw groups of bikers talking quietly among themselves. Jake Thornton stood with just 2 loyal followers now, while the rest had spread out, some talking with Marcus Thompson's Freedom Riders. Officer Rodriguez, the first backup to arrive, jumped out of his car with his hand on his weapon. Sarah raised her hand calmly, signaling that everything was under control. "It's okay," she called out to her fellow officers. "We're just having a community discussion about noise levels." Her voice carried a hint of amusement that made even some of the bikers crack small smiles. Marcus Thompson stepped forward, his presence commanding respect from everyone present. "Officer Mitchell here has shown us all something important today," he said, his deep voice carrying across the parking lot. "Sometimes the bravest thing isn't standing against someone, it's standing with them." The older knight named Bill nodded in agreement. He turned to the younger members who had left Jake's side. "I've been riding these roads for 30 years, he said. "Seen a lot of changes. Maybe it's time we made some changes of our own." Jake spat on the ground, his face still twisted with anger. "You're all weak," he snarled. "This ain't what the Iron Knights stand for." "No," Bill replied firmly. Maybe it's time the Iron Knights stood for something better. Inside Lou's bar, someone had finally turned down the music. The afternoon sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the parking lot. More people from the neighborhood had gathered to watch, drawn by the police cars and the unusual sight of two rival biker groups standing together. Sarah noticed a young black girl, maybe 12 years old, watching from behind her mother at the edge of the crowd. The girl's eyes were wide with wonder as she looked at Sarah in her uniform. It reminded Sarah of herself at that age, seeing her father in his police uniform and leather riding jacket. Marcus Thompson walked over to Jake, who tensed up immediately. But Marcus wasn't there to fight. I remember when you first started the Iron Knights, he said quietly. You were different then, had dreams about brotherhood and freedom on the road. What happened to that man, Jake? Jake's face flickered with something, perhaps a memory of who he used to be. His two remaining followers looked uncertain, watching their leader closely. Sarah stepped forward. Mr. Thornton, she said formally, about that noise complaint. I think we can handle it with a warning today, if you're willing to work with us on keeping the peace going forward. It was an olive branch, offered in front of everyone. Jake looked around at his former followers, at the watching crowd, at the other officers who were now standing relaxed but alert. He seemed to deflate slightly, as if a great weight was pressing down on him. Whatever, he muttered, but there was less anger in his voice now. More confusion, maybe even a touch of shame. Bill took charge of the situation. We'll keep the music down, he announced. And maybe it's time for some changes in the Knights. Marcus, you think you could spare some time to talk about how your club handles community relations? Marcus smiled. My club meets every Thursday night. You're all welcome to join us. He looked pointedly at Jake. All of you. The crowd began to disperse as the tension disappeared. The other police officers returned to their cars, responding to new calls. Sarah stayed, watching as members of both motorcycle clubs began to mingle, sharing stories and finding common ground. The young girl she had noticed earlier approached her shyly, her mother following close behind. Are you really a police officer? The girl asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. Sarah knelt down to the girl's level. Yes, I am. And you know what? You could be too, someday if you want to be. The girl's face lit up with a huge smile. Behind her, Sarah saw Jake Thornton watching the interaction. For just a moment, their eyes met, and Sarah saw something change in his expression, a crack in the armor of hatred he had worn for so long. As the sun set over Lou's bar, the sound of motorcycles firing up filled the air. But this time, it wasn't the roar of anger or defiance. It was the sound of change, rumbling through the streets of Cedar Grove like distant thunder before the rain. A week after the confrontation at Lou's bar, Sarah Mitchell sat in her patrol car outside the local diner, finishing her paperwork from the morning shift. The story of what happened had spread through Cedar Grove like wildfire, with each telling making it sound more dramatic than the last. Her radio crackled. Officer Mitchell got a call from Lou's bar. Someone's asking to speak with you specifically. Sarah checked her watch. It was almost the end of her shift, but something told her this was important. Copy that. On my way. When she pulled into Lou's parking lot, she was surprised to see Jake Thornton sitting alone on a bench outside the bar. He looked different. Tired, older somehow, without his usual group of followers around him. Didn't think you'd come, Jake said as she stepped out of her car. Sarah walked over but kept a professional distance. You asked for me. Here I am. Jake stared at the ground for a long moment. His hands were clasped together, knuckles white with tension. Been doing a lot of thinking this past week, he said finally, about what you said about your father. Sarah waited, letting the silence stretch between them. A warm breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the smell of approaching rain. My old man, Jake continued, his voice rough with emotion. He was a mean drunk. Used to beat on me and my mama pretty bad. One night, when I was 14, a black cop showed up at our door. Neighbor had called about the noise. He looked up at Sarah for the first time. That officer, he didn't just arrest my dad. He sat with me on our front porch, talked to me for hours. Told me I could be better than my old man, that violence and hate would only poison my own life. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She hadn't expected this conversation, not from Jake Thornton. I never forgot that night, Jake said. But somewhere along the way, I became exactly what that officer told me not to be. Started the Knights because I wanted brotherhood, something I never had at home. But I turned it into something ugly. A few raindrops began to fall, pattering on the parking lot's asphalt. Neither of them moved. Last Thursday, Jake continued, I went to that Freedom Riders meeting Marcus invited us to. Bill and some of the others were there too. Marcus told us about his grandfather, who rode bikes back in the 60s when it wasn't safe for a black man to travel alone. Told us about the white riders who stood with him, protected him. Sarah thought about her own father, about the stories he used to tell her about finding friendship in unexpected places. I've been carrying this hate around so long, Jake said, his voice cracking slightly. It's heavy, real heavy. When you told us about your dad that day, about how he tried to talk to those men even as they... He stopped, taking a deep breath. It made me realize I'd become what I hated most. Someone who hurts others because of my own pain. The rain was falling steadily now, but they stayed where they were, this moment too important to interrupt. I can't change what I've done, Jake said. Can't take back the words or the hate, but I talked to Marcus, and we got an idea. Want to turn the Knights into something different. Something that helps people instead of hurting them. Sarah finally sat down next to Jake on the bench, both of them getting soaked by the rain. My father used to say that the hardest road to ride is the one that leads to changing yourself. Jake nodded slowly. Your dad sounds like he was a wise man. We'd like to meet him. He would have given you a chance, Sarah replied softly. Just like that officer gave you one when you were 14. They sat in silence for a while, letting the rain wash over them. It felt symbolic somehow, like the heavens were helping to wash away old hatred and pain. The Knights are meeting tonight, Jake said finally. Would you? Would you come and talk to them? Tell them about your father? Help us figure out how to be better. Sarah looked at this man who had been her enemy just a week ago, seeing now the scared 14-year-old boy still living inside him, and the possibility of redemption that lived there too. Yes, she said simply. I'll come. The Iron Knights clubhouse was an old warehouse on the edge of town. That evening, as Sarah pulled into the parking lot, she saw more bikes than she expected. Not just Knights, but Freedom Riders too, and even some unaffiliated bikers from around Cedar Grove. Marcus Thompson's bike was parked near the entrance. He was waiting for her, his face breaking into a warm smile as she got out of her car. Glad you came, Officer Mitchell. Tonight's going to be important. Inside, the warehouse had been transformed. The old racist symbols and Confederate flags that once covered the walls were gone. Instead, the bare walls seemed to represent a clean slate, a new beginning. About 50 bikers filled the space, sitting on folding chairs or standing in small groups. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, like a family gathering where old wounds were finally being addressed. Jake stood at the front of the room, looking nervous but determined. When he saw Sarah, he nodded slightly, then called everyone to attention by tapping a wrench against an old metal barrel. Most of you know why we're here, he began, his voice rough with emotion. The Iron Knights started 20 years ago because I wanted to create something that felt like family. But somewhere along the way, we lost our way. We let hate poison what could have been something good. The room was completely silent. Some of the older knights looked down at their boots, while younger members watched Jake with a mix of surprise and respect. Officer Mitchell is here tonight, Jake continued, gesturing toward Sarah. Not as a cop, but as someone who showed me that change is possible. Even for someone like me, who's been carrying anger and hate for so long, I almost forgot who I was without it. Sarah stepped forward when Jake motioned for her to join him. Standing in front of these bikers, she didn't see enemies anymore. She saw people struggling with their own battles, their own pain, just like everyone else. My father, she began, her voice clear and steady, believed that every person had good in them, even if it was buried deep. He believed this until the day he died. And standing here tonight, I see that he was right. For the next hour, people stood up and shared their stories. Bill talked about his black granddaughter and how she had opened his eyes. A young knight named Tommy spoke about growing up with racist parents and how joining the club had only reinforced his prejudices until now. Marcus Thompson shared stories about the Freedom Riders' history, about white and black bikers riding together during the civil rights era, protecting each other on dangerous roads. Then something unexpected happened. A local black business owner, Mr. Johnson, who had often complained about the Knights, stood up to speak. I've hated this club for years, he said honestly. Called the police on you more times than I can count. But what I'm seeing tonight, this is what real change looks like. If you're serious about this new direction, my auto repair shop could use some good mechanics. Don't care what color you are, just need people willing to work hard and treat others right. Several younger knights sat up straighter at this, hope lighting up their faces. Jake looked stunned, as if he hadn't expected forgiveness to come so quickly or from such an unexpected source. Here's what I propose, Jake said finally. We keep the name Iron Knights, but we change what it means. Instead of standing for hate, we stand for brotherhood. Real brotherhood that includes everyone. We work with the Freedom Riders, learn from them. Do charity runs, help the community. He pulled out a box from behind the barrel and opened it. Inside was a new patch for their vests, the old Iron Knights logo, but with a significant change. The mailed fist now held an olive branch instead of a sword. This is our new beginning, Jake announced. Anyone who wants to stay with the Knights needs to earn this new patch, not by fighting or hatred, but by showing they understand what real brotherhood means. Sarah watched as the bikers approached the box one by one, looking at the new patch with various emotions on their faces. Some nodded in approval, others looked thoughtful, and a few walked out the door. But most stayed. Outside, the sun was setting on Cedar Grove, casting long shadows through the warehouse windows. But inside, something new was dawning, the beginning of real change, built on understanding and hope instead of fear and hatred. 3 months after the meeting at the Iron Knights clubhouse, Cedar Grove had started to feel like a different town. The change began small, like ripples in a pond, but grew larger with each passing week. It started with Mr. Johnson's auto repair shop. True to his word, he hired 3 former Iron Knights as mechanics. Tommy, the young biker who had spoken about his racist upbringing, turned out to be particularly skilled with engines. His work brought in customers from all over the county, regardless of their race or background. One sunny Saturday morning, Sarah was patrolling downtown when she saw something that made her stop her car and watch. Jake Thornton was teaching a group of kids, black, white, and Hispanic, how to safely maintain their bicycles. He sat on the sidewalk outside Lou's bar, patiently showing them how to fix flat tires and adjust their brakes. Officer Mitchell, one of the kids called out, waving excitedly. Mr. Jake's teaching us to be mechanics. Sarah walked over, noticing how Jake didn't tense up anymore when she approached. Instead, he smiled slightly, focusing on helping a young black girl oil her bicycle chain. Community outreach, he explained, wiping grease from his hands. Marcus suggested we start with the kids. Show them that bikers can be good people, that we can all help each other. The local newspaper had picked up the story of the Iron Knights' transformation. Their headline read, "From Division to Unity, How One Town's Biker Club Changed Its Colors." The article featured photos of the Knights working with the Freedom Riders on various community projects, food drives, home repairs for elderly residents, and motorcycle safety courses at the high school. But not everything was perfect. Some of the old Knights who had walked out that night at the clubhouse had started their own group in the next county over. They called themselves the True Knights and held on to their hatred like a badge of honor. Sarah kept an eye on the situation, working closely with Marcus and Jake to prevent any conflicts. The 2 men had become unlikely friends, often seen sharing coffee at the diner, planning new ways to bring the community together. One day, Bill's granddaughter got married in the town square. The ceremony made local news because of who attended. Members of both the Iron Knights and Freedom Riders stood side by side, celebrating love that crossed the barriers they had once defended so fiercely. The police department noticed changes too. Chief Wilson, who had been skeptical of Sarah's handling of the Lou's Bar incident, now used it as a training example. Sometimes, he told new officers, the bravest thing isn't drawing your weapon. It's having the courage to see the humanity in someone who sees none in you. Sarah's approach to policing influenced her fellow officers. They started spending more time talking to people in the community, learning their stories, understanding their struggles. The number of violent incidents in Cedar Grove dropped significantly. The Iron Knights clubhouse transformed as well. The bare walls were now covered with photos of their community work, newspaper clippings, and thank you letters from people they'd helped. A special place was reserved for a framed picture of Sarah's father on his midnight blue Harley, donated by Sarah herself. One evening, as Sarah finished her shift, She found Jake waiting by her patrol car. He looked different now. The anger that had once seemed permanently etched on his face was gone, replaced by something calmer, more thoughtful. "Got something to show you," he said, leading her to his bike. On the back was a new patch she hadn't seen before. Below the Iron Knight's new olive branch logo were the words, "In memory of Officer James Mitchell." Sarah felt tears in her eyes as Jake explained, "Every new member has to earn this patch now. They'd have to learn your father's story, understand what he believed in. His legacy lives on through what we're trying to become." The sun was setting over Cedar Grove, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. From somewhere in town, they could hear the sound of motorcycles, probably the Knights and Freedom Riders heading to their weekly joint meeting at Lou's Bar. "Your father was right," Jake said quietly. "That hate coming from fear, and fear coming from not understanding each other. Took me a long time to learn that lesson, but I'm teaching it to others now." Sarah nodded, touching the patch gently. Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest moments of understanding, like a quiet conversation in a bar parking lot on a sunny afternoon. 1 year after the confrontation at Lou's Bar, Cedar Grove hosted its first Unity Ride. Over 300 motorcycles thundered through the streets, led by an unlikely pair, Jake Thornton and Officer Sarah Mitchell, who had taken up riding her father's restored midnight blue Harley. The event wasn't just a motorcycle parade. It was a celebration of how far the town had come. Bikes of every make and model rolled through the streets, carrying riders of all races and backgrounds. The Iron Knights rode alongside the Freedom Riders, their new patches gleaming in the summer sun. Sarah, now promoted to Community Relations Sergeant, couldn't help but smile as she led the procession. She thought about how much had changed in just 1 year. The Iron Knights had become one of the most respected motorcycle clubs in the state, known for their community service and youth mentoring programs. The ride ended at Lou's Bar, which had been transformed into something of a community center. The old building's walls were now covered with photos showing the history of both motorcycle clubs, the good and the bad, preserved as a reminder of how far they'd come. Inside, Jake had set up a special display, "The Bridge Builders," read the sign above a collection of photographs. It showed moments from the past year, Knights helping rebuild homes after a storm, Freedom Riders teaching motorcycle safety at schools, both clubs working together at food banks and charity events. "Never thought I'd see the day," Marcus Thompson said, standing next to Sarah as they watched people fill the bar. "Jake's become one of our strongest allies. Sometimes the hardest hearts, once changed, become the most passionate about making things right." The transformation hadn't been easy. The true Knights in the next county still caused trouble occasionally, but their numbers were dwindling. Several of their members had defected after seeing the positive changes in Cedar Grove. Mr. Johnson's auto repair shop had expanded, now employing 6 former Knights and 3 Freedom Riders. It had become a model for other businesses in town, showing that giving people a chance could lead to success for everyone. The police department had changed too. Sarah's promotion wasn't just about recognition, it was about implementing her approach to community policing throughout the force. New officers were trained to see beyond badges and patches, to look for ways to build bridges instead of walls. Bill's granddaughter now worked as a dispatcher for the police department, her desk decorated with photos of both the Iron Knights and Freedom Riders at her wedding. She often joked that she had the largest, most diverse extended family in Cedar Grove. As the celebration continued, Tommy, now head mechanic at Johnson's shop, brought his newborn daughter to meet everyone. The baby wore a tiny leather jacket with both the Iron Knights and Freedom Riders patches, symbolizing the new generation that would grow up without the burden of hatred. Jake stood up to make a speech, something he'd gotten better at over the past year. "A year ago," he began, his voice carrying across the crowded bar, "I thought strength meant standing against people who were different from us. Now I know that real strength is standing with people, learning from them, growing together." He turned to Sarah. "Sergeant Mitchell showed us that change is possible, even for those who seem lost to hate. Her father's spirit lives on in what we built here. The Iron Knights will never forget that lesson." Sarah thought about her father, about how proud he would be to see this moment. She remembered his words about fear and understanding, about the importance of seeing the humanity in others. His wisdom had helped transform not just one person or one club, but an entire community. As the sun set on the first Unity Ride, the sound of motorcycles filled the air again. But this time, they weren't running from the law or causing trouble. They were celebrating a new kind of freedom. Freedom from hatred, freedom from fear, freedom to be part of something bigger than themselves. The story of Cedar Grove, the Iron Knights, and Officer Sarah Mitchell became known throughout the region. Other towns started reaching out, asking how they could create similar changes in their communities. Sarah always told them the same thing. It starts with one person willing to see beyond the surface and another person willing to change. The rest is just keeping your heart open and your courage strong. The Midnight Blue Harley stood outside Lou's bar, now bearing both the Iron Knights and Freedom Riders patches. It was more than just a motorcycle. It was a symbol of how far they'd come and a promise of how far they could still go.